guys, it's Coach Gaglione here. This is another edition of our kind of training around pain series. Again, I want to preface all these videos by just saying that I'm not a doctor. This is just kind of, all this information is coming purely from anecdote, my own personal experience for working with athletes and lifters for the past 13 years, as well as my competitive experience for the past 13 years as well. Again, so just take that with a grain of salt. If you are kind of dealing with some really, really serious issues, we recommend you check out clinicalathlete.com. Actually, go visit a PT, physical therapist, or a doctor in your area that kind of deals with athletes. That's always going to be the most important thing. And if you are kind of doing something serious, if you have a serious issue, don't be smart, listen to your body, and don't kind of train into pain. So if you are having some issues with your hip, number one thing that I think is going to be often mislooked is kind of making sure you're rooting properly. And we're going to go through some different drills and things today to kind of affect that, as well as some single leg type stuff. I think that could be really helpful, especially if you are, a lot of times with powerlifters, we train only bilaterally, just kind of on 2 feet all the time. So doing some single leg work, some single leg kind of rooting and balancing stuff can be effective, especially from a health standpoint, just making sure you don't have side to side differences. We're all going to have some asymmetry. That's just kind of part of life, especially as athletes. But if you're having especially some kind of hip pain or discomfort on one side, that's going to be really effective. So number one is going to making sure you're rooting properly. So when we're talking about rooting the feet, we're talking about having the big toe, little toe, and the heel in good contact with the floor, even pressure throughout. The weight is going to typically, should be over your midfoot, especially when we're talking about squatting and deadlifting. That's going to be really important. And we want to kind of be active with the feet. So what I mean by that is we're thinking about actively twisting our feet on the ground. That's going to actively kind of engage the muscles of our external rotators, our abductors, and all the muscles surrounding the hip. If we're passive and we're just squatting down or deadlifting passively, we're not going to have those muscles kind of on tension. They're not going to be potentiated or stimulated as much. So our hip kind of tracking is not going to be as effective. So number one, and obviously we could do some things with the hip circle and things like that that we've kind of talked about. So a lot of this stuff is kind of is going to be very similar to a lot of. There's going to be some overlap between the low back and the hip as well. We also want to pay attention to our pelvis position, because that's going to kind of dictate if certain things are getting tighter or looser, or certain muscles are more on slack and other muscles are more tight. So pay attention to your pelvis position. Pay attention to if you're rooting your feet or not, engaging your core, having your ribcage stacked over your pelvis. Those are going to be really important things. So that's number one. I would say most of the time, from our experience, for dealing with some lifters with hip pain, oftentimes, not all the time, it's usually from a lifter that's going too wide too soon, or just going too wide in general. So everyone wants to kind of limit their range of motion. This is probably the most common in a bench press, but this happens with squatting or deadlifting too. So let's say we have a lifter who's switching over from conventional to a sumo deadlift, or a close stance squat to a wider stance squat, or maybe they're transitioning from raw to equipped lifting and they want to start to widen their stance out. They usually just go through that process too quickly. So I recommend when you're trying to adjust your stance, do it slowly, and also make sure you're respecting the architecture of your hips. If you are one of the few people who are equipped lifters like myself, I also recommend that you don't always have to work with a wide stance all the time. As you get close to a competition, obviously you want to train more frequently in your competition stance, but especially when you're going raw, also make sure that you're protecting your body, because you're not going to have that compression when you're like in your squat suit or squat brief. So keep that in mind. So check your stance and check how low you're going. It's very popular nowadays to go like excessively deep, but you don't get any bonus points for going past an extra inch or two below parallel. So ideally you want to hit a good standard that's slightly below parallel, and you want to try and make that repeatable. Obviously, if you're going a little bit deeper, you don't want to leave any doubt in the judge's eyes, but I would say, barring, unless you're competing at the USAPL or IPF level, most of the time just barely breaking parallel is going to be fine, and you probably will get 3 white lights, especially at a local contest, for most of the people watching here. So you don't need to go crazy with depth. It's more important that you keep good position and don't go excessively deep. Everyone's architecture is different, and this is especially important for people that have kind of longer legs relative to their torso. People that really tend to bend over a lot more when they squat, and squatting tends to be a little bit more challenging for them. Don't go excessively deep. Go to a range of motion that you can control. In the beginning, especially if you're dealing with some discomfort, there might be a range of motion, so using a box in combination with a hip circle, for example. So that's going to allow you to make sure the muscles are active, and you're also limiting depth to a range that is comfortable and pain-free. So definitely check your stance, definitely check your depth. There's probably a stance, and there's probably a range of motion that you're going to be able to train through pain-free and allow you to still get a training effect while you're kind of working with your PT or your doctor to make sure you're injury-free and feeling good. Obviously, we talked about already, make sure your core is active. So now, one thing that we want to check, and this would be best done with a partner, we'll definitely include a link in the description. Check out our assessment video, and we also have a video on the hip scour test. So you can do this with a partner, but that's going to just basically scour the hip joint to see which stance is going to be effective for you. If you're getting a pinch, especially without load, in that kind of front of the hip, that's probably not going to be the best stance for you. So there's probably going to be a range of motion that feels comfortable. Obviously, I was kind of doing it to myself, so it's not the best case scenario, but you'd have a partner do it with you, so it's more passive, and you can kind of find that optimal kind of stance width that respects your personal body. The reason that we do it on the floor, they put your spine in a neutral position, so it kind of takes the lower back out of the equation. Okay, so that's the hip scour test. You want to do that with a partner. That's going to probably be the most important thing, especially if you're dealing with some discomfort. All right, so now when it comes to a rooting standpoint, there's a lot of different things that we can do. I'm going to show a couple of different things. So I think especially if you're dealing with like one-sided hip pain, doing some stuff single leg is going to be important. So one thing we want to look at is like our hip hinging ability, especially from a single leg when we're dealing with some hip discomfort. So that's going to work on rooting on one side and also making sure we're kind of hinging effectively on one side. So we're going to look at, this is just from like a rooting standpoint we're going to talk about now. One thing that we could do is this a single leg hinge. So this is where I would kind of start with people with a supported environment. What we want to do is start balance and shift your weight over to the leg that you're going to work. And we want to try the best we can to keep a good stable foot so our big toe, little toe, and heel remains in contact with the floor. So I'm going to shift my weight into my left leg. I'm going to put my weight on the bench, and I'm going to hinge back. And as you can see, I'm not perfect with this drill. But that is a good way to start a single leg hinge pattern. A lot of people have difficulty doing like single leg deadlifts and hip airplanes and things like that. So that's a good way to progress. And obviously I would do that on both sides. So again, I'm going to shift my weight onto one side and hinge back. And I can hold this position isometrically for time and also do repetitions. I'll do a combination of both. You can do that as part of a warm-up or just as an exercise itself. As you get a little bit more proficient, you can obviously take the bench away. You could also kind of eliminate the sliding action, so I could just, this would be a little bit harder even still, and just be slightly supported. So just kind of eliminate the sliding part of it. Eventually you want to get to the point where I could hold something, would be another progression. So now I'm going to take the foot away, and I can just lightly hold something for balance. And then eventually being able to hold the position with no so again, not perfect, so I should be able to kind of hold this position. And I can also do repetitions here. And then eventually kind of progress to something like a hip airplane type deal, which I'm not very good at, but I can kind of work on rotating here and then coming back. So I'm working kind of the internal, external rotation as well. And again, trying to keep that rib cage stacked over the pelvis. So that's some really good kind of single leg rooting type drills that you could do, especially if you're kind of dealing with some kind of hip issues on side to side. Other things that we kind of brushed over is just kind of working your hip flexors as well. So there's a bunch of different ways we could do this. You can find a height that's kind of comfortable for you. So this is kind of good. So I'm kind of working on balance. I'm just going to simply lift up So this might be too high for people to start, but this is probably okay for me. I'm just going to basically lift off the ground, so I'm actively working this hip flexor. When the hip is flexed above 90 degrees, you're going to work your psoas muscle. So this is going to be important for stability into like the bottom of the squat. If you can envision, this was like one side of the squat. I'm going to work on stability on that one side, and then I'm going to work on stability. So I'm squeezing my glute on this side, keeping my ribs cage stacked over my pelvis, and holding that for time. As I get a little bit more comfortable, I find this a little bit harder. Some people might find this easier, but you're basically going to do like a dead bug type motion with some resistance. So we're resisting. The band's going to try to pull me out of hip flexion. So as I extend out, I'm creating more and more tension here. And you can see that it wants to move out of position. Obviously, you could start with just your dead bug by itself and then progress to using the band. You could use a band, you could use a hip circle. There's a variety of tools you could use for that. So we addressed rooting, we addressed hip flexor strength. So it's going to allow you to kind of think about, we talk about a lot of times with benching, pulling yourself down to the bar. Pulling your body to the bar, engaging your lats, but we often don't talk about pulling yourself down in a squat, and you want to do the same thing. So using your kind of hip flexors and your core, your trunk muscles to kind of pull yourself, you're actively descending in the squat. You're not just dive bombing, especially people with hip problems, this is going to be key. So for people that like lift in a squat suit, they kind of understand that action even better. Okay. We talked about hip flexor strength and rooting. So this is a little bit, let's say this is a little bit outside the scope of the hip itself. But one thing I also want to talk about is Copenhagen plank. I will say, maybe you can link in the description, but Jordan Shallow probably has a much better video and understanding of this than me. So you can check out his video on the Copenhagen plank. But basically, if you're dealing with any type of hip issues or hamstring or like medial hamstring or groin type stuff, I wanted to kind of, this was kind of connected to the hip, so I wanted to kind of also showcase this. Maybe we'll do a separate video on it, but if you are kind of dealing with some kind of groin strains, the adductors are also aid in hip extension, which is why you kind of see knees kind of collapse into the squat. If the glutes aren't strong enough to kind of do their job and things like that, that's why you'll kind of see the knees kind of collapse in, because the adductors can aid in hip extension. It's not the most efficient way to do this. But we still want to keep them healthy and strong. Or if sometimes we see a groin pull, like with a sumo deadlift or things like that. These are kind of ways to kind of help mitigate that, and kind of Copenhagen planks has shown to be effective on preventing some of these medial hamstring and kind of groin adductor type issues with athletes. So you give these a try. There's a couple different variations. Again, I prescribe these a lot if, again, someone has some sort of like kind of medial hamstring or kind of groin issues. So the further I come out, it's going to make it harder. Obviously, so the closer I am, it's going to make it a little bit easier. But basically, gravity's going to try to pull me down, so I'm going to have to actively use my adductor to, and I can kind of be active with this hip and do some different things. I can clamp down. Now, if I want to make this more challenging, I can start to come further out. And obviously I would do that on both sides. I could do repetitions like this. There's a lot of different things you could do, but again, I'm kind of working that kind of groin. I can do some different cycling motions on this side. That's going to be a great way to kind of work that inner thigh, which is often a neglected area, especially for powerlifting. We talked about this a little bit in the low back video, but also any type, so obviously working the hips, etc., but any type of kind of side plank, kind of clamshell type movements. We could add a band here if we want to work this top leg a little bit more. And also, if I bring my knees in front, doing that hip raise is an excellent exercise to, now that I'm working more of the bottom leg. So I'm going to abduct and extend. So this is something that admittedly I probably should add a little bit more into our programs, but I just wanted to kind of showcase it with you guys. Recently went to the glute lab in San Diego and kind of learned this from some of the Breck and Cheris's trainers. So we kind of went over that. So that's the hip, sideline hip raise. The differences between with the clamshell, my knee's going to be in line with my hip. Now my knees are going to be kind of perpendicular to my hip. So I'm abducting and extending. And I'm going to work that side. So I do that on both sides, obviously. Any type of single leg bridge and single leg activity is going to be important. So obviously you can do your reverse lunges and your split squats. So we'll kind of just go through technique really quickly on those, and also single leg bridges would be the last piece. So when we're doing any type of split squat, I like to start with a 90-90 position. We could obviously elevate the back leg to make it more challenging. We could elevate the front leg to make it more challenging. We could do something more dynamic. So I would start off with something static, 90-90, trying to push through here. So I'm actively working mobility on this side and strength on this side. If I want to make it more dynamic, I can go into a lunge. If I want to make it more hip dominant, I can flex my hip a little bit more. And obviously I can elevate the back leg. And this would be your classic, what we call a Bulgarian split squat. Now I'm getting more range of motion and more of a stretch on that leg. So step ups are also good, but just doing some sort of single leg training in the off season especially, or early in the training cycle for powerlifters, just for general health and especially for your hips, is going to be important. So the last piece would be glutes side to side. So the first thing is single leg marching. So just being actively able to contract our glutes one side at a time. Eventually I can do, so I'm not perfect at this either, single leg versions. Also, so that'd be a glute bridge. You can do the same thing with the hip thrust. Hip thrust just means back elevated. This is a little bit high, but I want to keep my chin tucked when I do these. So if I'm doing a march, I'm going to extend. So that's just isometric. And then if I want to do the actual exercise, this is a little bit tall. We sometimes really use these pads as a good height as well. And you could also do, if you want to make it a little bit more deadlift specific, I could also do a straight leg version. So to make it easier, come closer. To make it harder, further back, longer left arm. If you start to feel your hamstring too much, come a little bit closer. You want to make sure you feel that in your glutes. These can be done as a warm-up or actual exercise variation. And the last thing would just be for some relief. Any type of what we call kind of PRI. Again, I would look up PRI stuff. Breathing is good. We're going to have a posterior pelvic tilt. We're going to have our feet up. You can have your feet up on a bench or feet up on the wall. For the sake of this video, we'll just have the feet up on the bench. This would be good to do post-workout. So especially as powerlifters, a lot of times are always in anterior tilt, always arching. So I'm going to purposely engage my hamstring a little bit, posterior tilt, reach and round, and have a forceful exhale. So the difference between this and like maybe a standard kind of 90-90 drill or whatever is I'm really trying to purposely kind of reach and round, purposely posterior tilt, and purposely forcefully exhale a little bit more. So this would be more something you would do after the workout. So I'm not really concerned with bracing as much as exhaling and getting in that kind of rounded and posterior pelvic tilt position to give my hips and my low back some relief. And that kind of concludes hips. I know that was a lot of information. A lot of this stuff ties into the lower back as well. To recap, hip scour test. Check your stance first. That's going to be the biggest thing. Make sure you're active with your feet. Having a proper stance and being active with your body and actively rooting is going to solve probably 90% of the problems. If you're still having issues, check your mobility, check your strength, especially with all the muscles surrounding the hip. That's our episode for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Definitely check out the links below if you want to support the program. Please subscribe, please check out the links, and thank you for watching. Until next time, stay strong, and we'll see you soon.